Hello, and welcome to the Cognitive Edge, where teachers, librarians, parents, and education leaders come together to explore practical ways to help students become stronger thinkers and more confident learners. Um, I am your host, or the host, Dr. Daniel A. Sable, and today we are going to discuss a skill that affects nearly every part of a student's education, and that's reading comprehension, because it falls outside of the realm of just education. It could fall in the way of civil service jobs and other things that could, help you become employable. Um, a student may be able to pronounce every word on a page and still have little understanding of what the passage means. That student is technically reading the words, but the real purpose of reading, constructive meaning, is not really taking place. Reading comprehension is not simply remembering names, dates, or details. It involves understanding ideas, making connections, recognizing patterns, drawing conclusions, evaluating evidence, and explaining things in one's own words. The good news is that reading comprehension can be taught. Students do not have to be naturally strong readers to become thoughtful readers. They need direct instruction, regular practice, appropriate text, and opportunities to talk about what they want to do. Let us examine several simple strategies for teachers, librarians, and parents to help um, improve reading comprehension. So, uh, begin before the reading begins. Um, Comprehension, instruction should start before students read the first sentence. Strong readers prepare themselves for a text. They look at the title, they examine the illustrations, they notice headings, they think about the topic, and they make predictions about what they may encounter. Struggling readers often skip this presentation and this uh, preparation. Uh, they begin they begin reading without establishing any purpose or context. Before reading, ask students questions such as, "What do you think this text will be about? What do you already know about the topic? What do you notice about the title or pictures? What two questions uh, do you hope the text will answer?" These background, these questions, they activate background knowledge. And background knowledge basically gives you a sense of a mental structure into which they can place new information. So, for example, before reading a passage about hurricanes, students might discuss storms, weather warnings, emergency supplies, or personal experiences with severe weather. A student who understands the basic idea of a storm will have an easier time understanding more complex information about wind speed, evacuation, and storm surges. However, teachers should also listen carefully for misconceptions. Activating background knowledge does not mean accepting every idea as accurate. It means discovering what students currently believe so that instruction can go one way or another, which would be making it better, stronger, or different. Um, Students often lose focus because they do not know what they're supposed to notice. Before reading a clear Before reading, you really want to provide a clear purpose. You might say, read to discover why the character made this decision, or read to identify the causes of the conflict. Read to determine how the animal survives in its environment. Read to decide whether the author's argument is convincing. A purpose direct attention, um, and it transformed reading from moving through words into searching for meaning. So that does not mean every reading experience must feel like a test. Students should also read for enjoyment, curiosity, and personal interest. However, when teaching comprehension, a clear purpose helps students recognize the important parts of a text. Teachers um, teach students to preview a text before reading it closely. Um, for an informational text, students can examine the title, the section headings, the bold vocabulary, um, the captions, the photographs. There's a ton of different things that can be looked at, um, and added to a database. And some others are photographs, maps, charts. Um, we have diagrams, the opening and closing paragraphs. For fiction, students can examine the title, cover, chapter names, illustration, setting clues, and introductory paragraphs. Previewing gives students a basic map of the text. It helps them anticipate the subject, organization, and possible challenges that they may be facing. Ask students to really make predictions based on what they observe. Encourage them to complete the statement. I predict that this text will be about blank because blank, or the word because is important. It teaches students that predictions should be connected to evidence rather than just random guessing. One of the most effective ways to teach comprehension is through a think aloud. During a think aloud, the teacher reads part of a text and pauses to explain what is happening mentally. For example, the sentence is confusing, so I'm going to reread it more slowly. I apologize about this. My landscapers, they come here and they are very quiet sometimes they're very loud. You never know. Um, anyhow, so I noticed the author keeps mentioning the storm. I think the storm may become important later, or I do not know this word, but the next sentence gives me a clue about its meaning. This reminds me of something we read last week. Think aloud, make invisible thinking visible. Many students assume that strong readers understand everything immediately. They do not realize that experienced readers frequently pause, question, reread, predict, and revise their thinking. When teachers model these actions, students learn that confusion is not failure. Confusion is a signal that the reader needs to use a strategy. Um, One thing that teachers are honing in on is make sure to teach you guys, students, to ask questions. Good readers constantly ask questions before reading. They may ask, what do I already know? What do I expect to learn? What might happen? During reading, they may ask, what did the character, or why did the character do that? Or what does this mean? How does this section connect to the previous one? Um, does this information support the author's main point? After reading, um, they may ask, what was the central passage? Um, what evidence supports my conclusion? How did my understanding change? Teachers can provide students with questions, starters, but the long-term goal is for students to generate their own questions and really begin to get involved. Questions, they can also be divided into levels. Some questions have answers stated directly in the text. Other questions require students to really combine information from several parts of the text. Deeper questions require students to make influence, evaluate ideas, or connect the text to broader knowledge. Students should still experience all three levels. Comprehension really becomes shallow when instruction focuses only on questions that ask students to locate and copy information. Um, we have this idea of visualizing data, visualizing information, but what does that mean? Helping students visualize. Visualization means creating mental images from written language. When students visualize, they turn words into scenes, movements, sounds, emotions, or processes. If a story describes a cold, empty street covered in fog, students can imagine the setting. If an informational text describes a water cycle, students can picture water evaporating, forming clouds, and returning as rain. What do you see in your mind? Which words help you create that image? What sounds or movements do you imagine? How does the setting feel? Settings may draw a scene and then label the words or details that inform their drawing. The drawing itself is not the goal. The goal is to help students connect um, descriptive language to meaning. Visualization is especially useful when students are reading texts with unfamiliar settings, complex processes, or detailed descriptions. We need to teach students to make inferences. An inference is a conclusion based upon evidence and background knowledge. So the author does not always state everything directly. Readers may sometimes read between the lines, so to speak. Consider this example. Maria entered the classroom with wet hair, a dripping jacket, and muddy shoes. The passage does not say that it was raining. However, a reader can reasonably infer that Maria was recently outside in the rain. A useful formula is text Evidence plus background knowledge equals an inference. So text evidence plus knowledge plus background knowledge equals an inference. Students should always explain the evidence supporting an inference. Instead of saying Maria was outside in the rain, a student might say, I think Maria was outside in the rain because her hair and jacket were wet and her shoes were muddy. This distinction matters without evidence. Inference activities can become guessing exercises, and teachers can ask, really, what can we figure out that the author did not state directly? Which details support your conclusion? What background knowledge helped you? Could there be another reasonable explanation? That final question teaches students that some inferences are um, stronger than others, and that conclusions should remain open to revision when new evidence appears. Um, so, vocabulary knowledge strongly influences comprehension. The students may really understand the general subject of a passage, but may lose meaning when too many words are unfamiliar. Before reading, introduce a small number of words that are essential to understanding the text. Explain each word in student-friendly language. Use it in context. Provide an example even. Um, Show an image when appropriate. Um, Discuss related words, prefixes, suffixes, roots, synonyms, antonyms, and so on. During reading, teach students to use context clues. They can examine nearby words and sentences to determine what makes sense. However, context clues are not magic. Sometimes a passage does not provide enough information. A student must also learn how to use a glossary, a dictionary, a reliable digital reference, or a source. Students should not stop for every unfamiliar word. Um, that can destroy reading flow. You know, we really want students to ask, is this word essential to understanding the passage? Can I understand the passage um, without meaning of it? Does the text provide enough clues? Do I need to look it up? Does this help students become more independent and strategic? Identify the main ideas. We know that students often remember individual details without understanding the larger point. Teach them to distinguish between the main idea and supporting details. The main idea is what the text or section is mostly about. Supporting details explains, um, illustrates, proves, or expands on an idea. So we want to ask in our head, what is the author mainly trying to tell us? Which details are most important? Which details support the central point? Can we remove this detail and still understand the main idea? For informational text, headings and topic sentences often provide clues. For fiction, Students may need to identify the central conflict, the character's goal, or the lesson communicated through the story. A useful practice is not to ask students to state the main idea in one complete sentence. We want, if the statement is too broad, it may not capture the text accurately. If it's too narrow, it may describe only one detail. So finding the main idea requires students to really step back and view the text as a whole. Um, so how do we teach summarization? Summarizing is one of the best ways to check whether a student understands the text. A summary really presents the most important idea in a shorter form. Students really must decide what to include, what to leave out, and how the ideas connect. For fiction, students might identify the main character, the setting, the central problem, the most important events, the resolution. For informational texts, students might identify the topic or the main idea or the most important supporting details, the author's conclusion. Students, they often confuse summarizing with retelling every event. A summary should not repeat the entire text. One useful limitation is to ask students to summarize a section in one or two sentences. The limited space forces them to decide what matters most. Another really great strategy is to ask, who or what is this section about? What happened or what was explained? Why was it important? Summarization should be practiced orally as well as in writing. Students who struggle with written expression may understand the text, but may have difficulty showing that understanding on paper. We really want to encourage students to make connections. Readers understand text more deeply when they connect new information to existing knowledge. Connections generally fall into three categories. A text-to-self connection links the reading to the student's own experience. A text-to-text connection links the reading to another book, an article, or a film. A text-to-world connection links the reading to historical events, current issues, or broader social knowledge. For example, a student reading about a character might for example, a student reading about a character moving to a new school might connect that experience to a personal transition. A student reading a dystopian novel might connect its themes to another book about government control. A student reading about water shortages might connect the information to environmental challenges in the real world. Connections should support comprehensive, not every personal memory is relevant. Teach students to explain. The connection helps me understand the text because that phrase keeps the focus on meaning rather than allowing the discussion to really drift away from the reading. Um, Keeping monitor of comprehension. Perhaps the most important habit of a strong reader is noticing when the text is no longer um, understandable or making sense. Struggling readers, they may continue reading without realizing that they have lost understanding. Um, Teach students to stop periodically and ask, can I explain what I just read? Does this section make sense? How does it connect to the previous section? Is there a word or idea that is confusing to me? When comprehension breaks down, students need repair strategies. They can reread the sentence or paragraph, read more slowly, break a long sentence into smaller parts, look at a picture, a chart, or heading, use context clues, look up an important word, read ahead to see whether the next sentence clarifies the idea, maybe. Ask a question, it's always a big one. Summarize what they understand so far, and simply telling a student to read it again is not always effective. A student may reread the passage using the same unsuccessful approach. Instead, helping students identify the source of the problem is probably the better route to go. Um, we ask a lot of questions like, was the vocabulary unfamiliar? Was the sentence too complex? Did the student miss an important earlier detail? Did attention drift? You know, was there insufficient background knowledge? Once the problem is identified, the student can more carefully have a useful strategy to select better work for he or she. And reading comprehension should not always be a silent and isolated activity. Students often clarify their thinking by discussing a text with others. Partner conversations, small groups, literature, circle, and whole class discussions allow students to hear different interpretations. A student may notice evidence that another student missed. Another student may challenge an unsupported conclusion. A third may make a connection that deepens everyone's understanding. Teachers really should establish expectations for text based discussions. Um, Students should still be encouraged to use phrases, you know, such as, I think this because the text says blank, or I agree with the interpretation because I see it differently because which part of the text supports your idea? We have them now. This section made me consider or reconsider. These sentence structures help students disagree productively and really support their ideas with evidence. The goal is not for every student to give the same answer. The goal is for students to develop interpretations that are reasonable, thoughtful, and supported um, by the text. Students, they cannot practice comprehension effectively if every text is either far too easy or impossibly difficult. Text should provide an appropriate level of challenge and really fill in the gaps where understanding may not be. Um, a text that is too easy may require students to use a new strategy, or a text that is too difficult may overwhelm vocabulary, background knowledge, decoding, and working memory. And teachers and librarians, they should consider the student's reading ability, the complexity of the language, the student's familiarity with the topic, the length of the text, the structure of the text, the level of support available, student interest also matters. Students also are more willing to persist when they care about the subject. Choice can increase engagement, allowing students to select from several appropriate texts. Um, can create a sense of ownership without abandoning instructional goals. So that is the spiel for today. We discuss um, that of using different technology um, pieces to help learn reading. Um, and I think it's extremely important because reading and having the skills and um, the keys to unlock the doors will help you in your future. You just have to hang in there. All right, I'm Dr. Daniel Sable. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye bye.